Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Continual Panel Room. Tonight, we're discussing graphic novels as storytelling. And I'm going to ask each of our guests to go around and tell us a little bit about why they like graphic novels, what kind of work they do involving them, and anything else like that that they feel like tacking on. And since John is to my left, we'll start with John and we'll go that way.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me. My name is John Jennings. I'm a professor of media and cultural studies. So I teach comics. Actually, I teach about comics as a medium in a media program. I've been reading them since I was super young. And one of the things I love about the medium is the fact that it merges, image and text, obviously. Well, a lot of times it can, or sometimes it can't. But I love the fact that anyone who has a story, if they have access to some type of sequential images, whether it's photography, whether it's like stick figures, whatever, you can actually like tell a story and, take it to a copy shop or what have you, and you can publish a comic. And I love it's a very low bar for access and to publishing a comic. And I love that about it because it has this kind of like sense of irreverence to it. I also love the fact that every aspect of a comic can be used for storytelling. So from like the panel structure to, the way that the words are laid out, everything. As far as like my own work, I write, draw, edit, and publish comics. And so basically I have my hands in every aspect of making a comic book from, conception to publishing. So.
Thank you. Bobby?
Hi, I'm Bobby Nash. I started reading comics when I was a kid in the mid to late 70s. I still remember the first comics that I ever owned. It was one of those where they had the 3-packs in the checkout aisles. And one of those where I begged and pleaded my mother and she just shut me up, said, fine, you can have them. And so I remember it was 3 issues of Spider-Man. And after getting those, I was hooked. And so I still love reading comics today. What I do in comics, I write. I doodle a little bit, but I'm not quite at the level to where I can like really draw a comic, but I can doodle enough to doodle sketches for people, or if I want to get something across to the artist, I can say, I was thinking something like this, and then give it to the artist so the artist can make it look better. But I've been writing comics off and on for quite a number of years, and I still love it. I love the fact that with comics, the sky's the limit. Like John said, there's anything you can do. You don't have to worry about budgetary constraints like you do in a movie. You want a planet of 1,000 aliens, you can have a planet with 1,000 aliens. Your artist may not like you for writing that, but you can, you can do all that. And so I love the fact that with comics, there are a lot of, potential stories that you can tell that just don't work anywhere else, that they are specifically comic stories, and that's fun to play with.
Alan?
Okay, I'm Alan Rauch. I used to do a lot of illustration. I teach now literature at UNC Charlotte, and one of the things I do is teach a graphic novel course on a regular basis. My first experience with the comics was not with Spider-Man, but I was a DC comic reader. And one of the things that, in spite of the fact that actually DC Comics made this happen, is that when I used to draw Superman, it never occurred to me that there was an S in the insignia. I thought it was in Kryptonese. And that was, which is now, the rhetoric that they're using. In any event, then I backed away from it for quite a while, even though I did do a lot of illustration, freelance, and that kind of thing, until somebody said, you need to read Maus. And one of the things that I realized, and I see a lot of people nodding, one of the things is, so I grew up a Jewish kid in Montreal, and all of a sudden my friends were saying, you need to read Maus. And Maus, when I was growing up, everything my parents wanted me to read had to do with instructing me on the Holocaust and so on. And I thought, do I want to read another thing on the Holocaust? But then I read Maus, and I realized that even though Spiegelman is about 15 years older than I am, hard to believe, that I was now returning to the medium that I had used, because I was reading comic books, to escape the very thing that my parents were trying to force me to read. And now I was reading it as comics. And so I got very interested in the idea of graphic novels and narrative. And to some extent, that's one of the impetuses of teaching the graphic novel, which I love to do pretty much on a regular basis.
Gregory?
Hi, everyone. My name is Gregory Wilson. We have a lot of college professors today. I'm a professor of English at St. John's University and teach courses in fantasy and science fiction and creative writing. And although not nearly as extensively as what Alan said, I've also taught graphic novels as well in my courses. And I came to graphic novels just before I get to my own work, actually through academics, because my father was a professor who got me reading King Lear through this graphic novel version that was done. They had a whole series of Shakespeare, and there have been multiple of them now. But at the time, this is late 70s, I think, they had a couple that had just come out that my father wanted me to take a look at. And it was, essentially true to the text, but it had this sort of striking quality of the visual image. And since Shakespeare was always meant to be seen, not simply read, as I try to talk a lot about with my students in those courses, that was something that had a really profound effect on me, because it gave a sense of what the power of the language was in inspiring the visual, because those things were matched so perfectly together with the image in a way sort of striking forth from the word. So, and the problem then is that I went away from it for a while because my art skill was nil. Like my creative talent is in other areas. My 12-year-old can outdraw me by a mile. That is not where my creative ability is. And I came back to it on the creative side a few years ago when I had written a novel called Icarus, and about a young man who falls into the heart of a dormant volcano and the creatures that he finds there. But it was a very visual thing. Even in my head, it was inspired by a couple of things I saw, including Cirque du Soleil. And it was about a year or two later that I ran into an artist and a publisher, both at Origins in Columbus, Ohio. And we just started talking a little bit about illustration and about art, and specifically about art in comic books and graphic novels, and whether or not this is something that could be combined together. That led to the first edition of the book. And literally just yesterday, I got the books in for the second edition and the sequel to that book of Icarus and Jelinek, which I'm not allowed to show. Am I allowed to show them, or am I not allowed to show them? Is it good or bad to do that? I'm
Well,
happy to
lots
do
of
either,
people have their books on the bookshelf behind
So I
them.
guess it's
I don't
okay.
see why you can't show it.
It's like I just want to stumble into the whoops. I'm super excited about them. But yeah, so that's how these came together. And I mentioned my daughter because my daughter also, who loves literature, really loves graphic novels, and was, I think, about as excited about getting these books as I was, because she felt really fully invested in kind of the visual aspect of the world. And so there's a generational thing for me too, because it reminds me a bit of what my father shared with me and what I get to share with her. So there's a lot of things, both personal and professional, I like about the graphic novel form.
Okay, David?
Yeah, I'm David Pepose. I'm the writer of Spencer and Locke 2, the upcoming Spencer and Locke 3, Going to the Chapel, and my latest Kickstarter, the OZ. And yeah, I probably got into comics for the same reason that everybody does, the money, respect, and professional security. Thank you all for laughing. No, I love comics because I love it's the stories that you tell in the constraints of it all. It's very much a Rubik's Cube. You're limited by the number of pages you have, and that's limited by the number of panels you can fit coherently, and that's limited to the amount of panels and word balloons you can fit without drowning out all the art. And if you really want to get into the nitty gritty, it's how many words can you fit per word balloon. That's the stuff I agonize about a lot. But also, as just a purely lazy writer, I love getting art in my inbox. That's sort of the carrot that keeps me going. I think we're all art lovers here on this panel.
Mm-hmm.
And, the thing is, if I had grown up, I grew up in Missouri. If I had known what reference art was as a kid, my life probably would have been very different. But as a result, I kind of focused on a different track creatively. So working with such talented collaborators, I've been lucky enough to work with people like Jorge Santiago Jr., Ruben Rojas, Gavin Guidry, seeing the way that they're able to kind of realize these characters. It's truly a feeling, and it feels like Christmas every time I open up my inbox and I get new art in it. And that's the thing that gets me out of bed when I then have to tackle a difficult script or figure out how to give notes on something. And so I think, telling stories that are that intersection of high concept, beautiful artwork, and emotional engagement, that's what I consider to be my calling.
Well, several of you have mentioned that you come to graphic novels by way of comic books, the
Sure.
standard monthly little booklet that so many of us buy. Do you think there is an advantage or a disadvantage to the graphic novel versus the trade paperback compilation of multiple issues of a comic book from a storytelling standpoint? Bobby, you want to start us off?
Sure. I think one of the things I loved about buying monthly comics, which I don't do as often as I used to, but one of the things I loved about buying monthly comics was that cliffhanger teaser. Ooh, I gotta wait. It's like watching TV, and ooh, I gotta wait a month, to see what happens next, and it builds that excitement in you as you're waiting and you're anticipating the next chapter. Comics has kind of gotten away from that a little. Not everybody really does the big cliffhangers or it just kind of ends, picks up the next one, because we are planning for that trade in a lot of cases. And some publishers want it to feel like for the people that pick up the trade, one big story, not here's 5 individual issues. But I love that. Knowing that having to wait to get all the story, and then when you're done, go back and reread the whole story. It's quite a lot like binge watching TV now. I go back and I can read 10 issues of whatever. So I think, though, as the audience changed, or not changed, as the audience grew, and we started getting people who weren't going to comic shops, who aren't going in every week or every month, and they're buying trades or they're buying straight to graphic novel stories, we don't want them to feel lost by trying to read a story going, ooh, this is a bad, it breaks the flow of the story. And so I think in writing a straight to graphic novel or planning for the trade, I think we try to take that into account to make it easier, not only for the people that are used to reading the comics and then the trade, but for people that go straight to trade, if that makes any sense.
Alan?
Well, one of the things that I was thinking about when Bobby was talking is a couple of years ago, I got an edition of Dickens's Nicholas Nickleby, keeping in mind that when people read Dickens originally, they read it in individual installments over basically an 18-month period. And the problem is really, as Bobby's suggesting, is that the rhetoric or the style, the marketing so I did try to read it. So, I would stop and I'd say, okay, I've done this part and I'm going to wait a month, and I'm not going to read I'm not going to read the next section until a month later. And what I found is that I'm not very good at that. And I think that not being very good at that is partly what's going on with the graphic novel today. And I'm not very good about reading individual issues, partly because, as you're suggesting, Bobby, the comic book store that I went to, Triangle Books, that I still remember vividly, they don't have places like that. I mean, I have a comic book store within walking distance of my house, but I don't typically do that. And there's something, and I'm also not a consumer of that kind of mediation of the graphic novel or of comic books the way that I used to be. So, I mean, and then now there are people who are writing these massive things like Emile Ferris's My Favorite Thing is Monsters, which come out, of course you have to wait. I mean, she hasn't had the second volume come out, but then they hit you like a brick. And in a way, it's a very good thing. It's very impressive. I mean, it's also exhausting, but so that's, things are changing, and we consume in such a different way. And of course, I do have my editions of Dickens that are bound together of the individual So at some point, Dickens went trade as well.
Gregory?
I was thinking about Dickens too. Yeah, I mean, the serialized nature, to get back to Bobby's point for a second, the sense that you're being brought along and then that anticipation builds over the course of the month and then you're picking up the next part of the story. I do think that this is something you've also seen as well in television that went to the big, super long form stuff in terms of the story arc that they tell. And now you're beginning to see, I think, a response to that with shows like The Mandalorian and things like that, which are trying to return to a very much, you know, there can be a through line, but there's still set stories that you won't necessarily return to. And part of the excitement isn't just what's going to happen next, but this adventure was great. When do I get to see the next adventure? And there's a sense that you have an investment in it and then it's done. And then you get to think about it and process it and go, that was really great, before the next adventure that you get to go on, very much like the original Star Trek and things like this too. So I think there's some value of that in the kind of original way comics were going. I have to say that I think a lot of reason that the sort of long form thing has become of greater interest is not just because of people like, you know, Alan Moore or Frank Miller, or people that were doing stuff that was a little longer to begin with, but also I think because this is a little bit what made academics take it more seriously. And that's not because the commercial market necessarily cares about what academics think, but I know, having spoken to many of them, that a lot of artists and authors cared about being taken seriously at the same level as these other writers. They should have been taken seriously to begin with. There's no doubt of that, right? You had certainly writers who were just as, you know, worthy or not worthy of academic respect as you had comic book writers and artists who were worthy and not worthy of respect. It had nothing to do with the medium. They were telling stories that had enormous value for all the reasons we've already talked about. But I don't think academics took it seriously until they began to see these things coming up in larger and longer forms where you could tell a sort of longer and deeper kind of story arc. The idea that you need to make comics safe for academics seems kind of ridiculous, but academics can be ridiculous, let's be clear. And so you look at people like I mentioned, Miller already, but also, you know, and Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman too, this sense of the sort of longer form work that would allow you to take it more seriously and teach it in a way where you felt like you could sink your teeth into it, right? And really analyzing it in great depth and not call it even a comic book as much as you do a graphic novel. You know, do we really know exactly what the delineation is from the comic book to the graphic novel? Or is it just what we kind of imagine those two forms to be? And so I think a lot of it came from what the Academy wanted to take seriously or not take seriously. And on the commercial side, I think then, because artists and authors are producing them, people then wanted to be able to read more of them also. And I'm kind of agnostic to it because I like episodic and longer form stuff regardless. And yeah, but it's been interesting to see the way that transition has operated over time.
David?
Yeah, you know, I mean, it's interesting because I feel like, you know, especially the way the industry is right now, things are more conservative, and so some of the issue to issue storytelling is just purely for business reasons, for financial sense, and so you can pay the artist for the next issue, and just kind of keep it going more piecemeal. I would say, just as somebody who has marketed singles and then put out trades, you know, the singles for me, I've always seen as the runway. It's sort of how you build that audience. It's kind of how you build that brand awareness. And then the trade kind of becomes the evergreen seller. Whereas the risk of doing just straight to trade is you get that one shot, sort of in terms of the publicity and the marketing of it all. And if it doesn't catch on, it's much harder for it to catch on later. I will say, you know, having written for both at this point, the thing that's most interesting to me, and Bobby touched upon this a little bit, was, you know, the structure of it all. You know, you end with those cliffhangers, but for me, the real kind of art form for monthly comics that you don't necessarily have to do in a graphic novel, a standalone graphic novel, is the exposition of it all. Every issue you've got to talk about, you kind of have to not only re-explain the plot, re-explain the high concept, but it's ever increasingly more complicated because of you have to also include what story progression you've hit. Mm-hmm. And that's always been the hardest part for me as a writer, but you have to do it this way if you're writing singles, because not everybody discovers it in issue 1. Sometimes they drop into issue 2 or 3. but yeah, I mean, I do feel like there are certain things that can be done in the standalone graphic novel form that might not be as easy to do in monthlies. For example, I really want to do something in the Groundhog Day kind of vibe. That's a lot harder to do month to month than to do it as one standalone storyline. So I think the way, though, that the industry seems to be kind of headed at this point, particularly post-pandemic, is the longer form storytelling, it's so much harder to sustain. Attrition is a thing. It's like gravity. Unless you're Brian K. Vaughan, you're going to hit that. So what I've been noticing anyway, at least as I've been pitching and getting stories out, is they're going for smaller and smaller arcs with the room for sequels. So if it catches on, you're able to continue it naturally, but still have a new launch point for a new arc. But if it doesn't pan out and the margins are thinner than ever these days, they can kind of wrap it up as a standalone really, really quickly.
You've all done a variety of different things. I mean, graphic novels are just one arrow in your quivers. So what is it about the graphic novel that draws you to explore a particular theme in your work by that medium? Alan, let's start with you.
Okay. So somebody who works a lot with images and illustration, and I still do some illustration in general. The idea of thinking about the impact of the image, and we're talking about longer forms versus episodic, and what's happening now as academics have sort of embraced this. They've incorporated the idea of the graphic novel back into the idea of representation of images. So one of the books I'm thinking about in this context is How to Read Nancy. And it's just this wonderful reversion to what we always consider a very simple comic book, but it's really a very nuanced treatment of the language of images. And as somebody who deals with a lot with historical images, the representation of animals that never really existed, and so on, it's really the art form is in some sense and something that has this incredible vocabulary that we really need to address separately, that are in some sense, because students are so used to, I'm sorry, I'm speaking about students, but readers are so used to seeing visual images and sort of sloughing them off, when the complexity of those images, and that's one of the reasons I always teach Asterios Polyp, because it is, which I think had to be, in terms of what David is saying, a one-off experiment. Of course, Mazzucchelli had this whole experience, but when you talk about how those images function and where they're going, it's a really complex things that the students have to embrace. And then every now and then I'll throw in something else that Mazzucchelli has done, including Batman and so on, and which makes us think about the complexity of comic books as opposed to graphic novels that, let's say, Mazzucchelli has been involved in. You say, well, that wasn't just Batman. It was a version of Batman that was Mazzucchelli at work, and it has all sorts of implications and meaning.
Well, I'm going to come back to John for the next one, because I just realized I did not come to you on the last question. So if you have comments to add on comics versus graphic novels or trade versions of comics, and then you want to pick up the theme, that would be great. Sorry about that.
No, not at all. Yeah, so it's something I've been thinking about quite a bit as an editor of primarily graphic novels. I'm over a new line of graphic novels over Abrams Comic Arts. And so the notion of how it's a lot is about, of course, the intersection between like art and commerce, right? I mean, we have all these different standpoints for it. I was thinking about the original use of the comic as far as like it being like really disposable and something. A lot of times people would read these single issues on their way to work or what have you, and consume them, and they really weren't supposed to be collected or considered special at all. They're actually supposed to be really disposable, right? And so the way that they were like constructed was around that notion of the utility of someone being on working in a factory job on a bus, and they'll read it and just keep going, and then of course you have these different industries that are kind of like ancillary to get connected to it. And of course, now we have like these different notions of how the stories are broken down. Bobby was talking about this, and so is Gregory as well, as far as like, decompressed or compressed storytelling, right? If you look at like the first Batman story is what, about 11 pages, 9 pages, I forget. So his entire, the Batman's entire origin is like a few pages, right? And now we have these episodic comics that are actually in some ways more akin to, say, like, as we said before, television, these longer arcs, one of my favorite runs recently was Warren Ellis's Moon Knight, because he did the kind of 70s style of compressed one issue, one shot adventure stories with Moon Knight that I thought were like, very much a throwback to the 1960s and 70s as far as like how those comics kind of function. And then again, another reason outside of the academic space, with stuff like, Mouse and the like, you also have a book like March, right, which was extremely commercially successful, that actually, we're talking about in the millions of sales. We're talking about a book that basically, when a university teaches it, they have their own version of the book, like their names are inscribed in the book. It's like really special, that kind of thing. So March as a trilogy of books actually kind of shifted a lot of things as well fairly recently. And now, of course, you have new, like basically older, book publishers who are looking very, very hard at like these graphic novel lines. Like, for instance, Random House has a new kids line, for instance, that Gina Gagliano is over, right? So from my own, my own standpoint, I'm looking at something in the middle. I mean, Gregory was talking about like the idea of like, well, what is the difference, right? I mean, generally, I think, more than like, say, 48 pages starts to become a graphic novel, I guess. Like my book, Blue Hand Mojo, is like 100 pages, but I refer to it as like a graphic novella because I feel like it's a little bit short, it's kind of shorter than what would be considered, graphic novel. We don't think about a page count on say, some of the books that Abrams is doing is like more like anywhere from, say, 96 pages and up to like 300 some odd pages, depending. So I think a lot of it's like the length and how the work is being like kind of talked about in that longer form. Personally, I don't buy a lot of like individual comics. I'll like to wait for the trade. I like to do the binge reading these days. I don't have the patience anymore. And also too, my wife won't let me like go and buy actual comics. So I'm usually on Comixology anyway. So, but there's some writers though that I feel, like Ta-Nehisi Coates' Black Panther, right? I think reads better as a trade. Like I think that, on a month-to-month basis, the pacing feels more like a novel, or like Nnedi Okorafor's Shuri graphic comics feel to me more like I was reading a novel, So I think it depends on the writer, but a lot of it's driven by commerce. I mean, right now, of course, it's like the Wild West because, post-pandemic, Diamond doing their shenanigans, post DC Comics, Blood in the Water, firing a third of the, editors. I mean, it's a lot of crazy things happening in like mainstream comics right now that I'm curious. And I also know that the people like bigger companies like Simon & Schuster and Lil Brown are throwing their hats into the ring to do like some very serious graphic novel work, right? So I don't know. Personally, I'm looking at some of the band dessinée page counts, like say 48 to 64 pages. It's like, which you can still do serialized, work with, but also, are not as labor intensive. That's one of the things too. Like comics are extremely difficult to produce, on a month-to-month basis without a team of people. So, and of course, you have these notions of the lone auteur as opposed to like a team, right? For me personally, I love the fact that comics speak so symbolically and it seems like there's an inherent surreality to the medium that I really, really like, So the notion of like the dreamlike state of, say, a symbolic communication is like, it seems to me almost like inherent in the medium of comics, and that's something that I really am attracted to.
Okay, Gregory?
Yeah, let me I want to come back to what John just said, because I think there's a lot of truth in that idea of the surreality. I was thinking about what Neil Gaiman said about this, and I'm paraphrasing it, but it's basically that it's the only medium in which you can represent the passage of time within a single page or image. And that was very powerful for me because, you know, I'm used to both teaching and myself in my own writing career, writing in a linear way, as we do, right? You know, coming from, even if you're producing a novel that is experimental in some way, still, you know, they're reading the first word and they're ending at the last word of the paragraph because it's the only way that we can put it together. And yes, we can later on try to have it cohere in our minds in different ways, but we're still reading it in a linear fashion where you're intended to start at point A, end up at point Z. And a lot of what we do in graphic novels is allow you to witness point A to point Z on a single page at the same time in a single moment. And I think that creates, first of all, John, what you said about that surreality, but also I would say that it creates this sense of sort of dynamism that is frozen in space, which is a very odd thing, it seems to me, right? Motion and movement where you can observe in exquisite detail every aspect of the motion and movement. And the implications of what that means, you know, it means that especially in the best ones, every act, every movement, every adjustment that's being made by the characters on the page is analyzed to a degree so that we're imagining it as if we were watching everything in slow-mo. And so it's one reason why, although obviously the most obvious connection that we make in terms of graphic novels to something else tends to be something like film or television, where you're scripting it sometimes in similar ways and there are movements there. But even there, right, you can hit a still shot, you know, you can freeze a recording, you can look at just a picture of something on a TV screen or on a movie screen, but still you've frozen the motion in a way that you don't have to do when you're looking at a graphic novel and you have the motion that is both frozen and at the same time moving. So I think that creates tension, I think it creates friction, and I think that most great art of any kind comes from tension and the resolution of tension and the working through of tension, but especially the establishing of tension, right? Go back to what Bobby said about building up anticipation, right? That's building up tension. It's building up, someone do something to make the next thing happen. That's what makes us go through and want to consume the art in the first place. So I think in a lot of ways, what's powerful about graphic novels and really as compared to any other medium is that it's always got that tension between dynamic movement and kind of frozen, absorb it all at one time space at the same time. And that's pretty striking to me.
David?
Yeah, I mean, you know, for me, there's so much diversity in the visual representation of it all. No two artists are going to approach a story the same way. And I think that adds so much variety and flavor to comics that you can't even see it in traditional film or television. No matter how much you do with CGI or how much you do with cinematography, you know, the human form is always going to look like the human form on film. Whereas, you know, comics, it's anything goes. You can look like somebody like Jim Mahfood, for example, who, you know, super scratchy graffiti style to somebody hyper realistic like Alex Ross. You know, for me, the thing that always kind of drew me to comics, some of it was just kind of how I was raised. I'm a third generation comics reader. I've grown up with these since I was a kid. You know, seeing that Eric Larson Spider-Man as a kid just like blew my mind. And so that was sort of like the chosen medium to work with. But as I've gotten older, I've also realized that comics are kind of the last great equalizer. It's challenging to get into the comics business, no doubt about it. But it's not Hollywood. You know, where you have to be geographically tied to one of maybe 3 locations, where you have to, you know, be working through these like punishing apprenticeships. And then maybe it's, you know, a gamble whether or not you even make it to the sort of field you want to be, or maybe you're just, you know, holding the boom mic. Comics, you know, it's really all you have to do to get in the business is make comics. And you don't need a huge crew to do that. It can be just you. It can be you and a friend. The books that I work on, we really have a core team of 4 usually. And it's a lot more DIY as a result. So you've got people in the direct market, the Marvels, the DCs, the Images. And those are, you know, that's a tough road to hoe. That's a really, you know, they refer to it as breaking into a prison. And every time that you break in, they seal up the hole and you got to figure another way in. You can self-publish, you can go online, you can do crowdfunding like Kickstarter. There's like John's been saying, there's a burgeoning market in traditional publishers. And I think that lends a lot of different opportunities for storytelling. And I think by sort of virtue of the history of the medium, particularly as far as the direct market is concerned, there's room to be a little more esoteric. It doesn't have to be that sort of solid quadrant storytelling. You can pick something that's a little out of left field. And, I've always considered my career to be coming up with trash concepts that I make you fall in love with. It's something that I don't think traditional Hollywood would necessarily respect, but comics, they really embrace that sort of stuff wholeheartedly. And I think that makes our industry so vibrant and unique. And there's a reason why we're considered the R&D for the rest of the entertainment industry. And it's because we have that DIY mentality. We have that sense of frequency where we have to be putting something out every single year. And I think that makes us, in a lot of ways, some of the best and scrappiest storytellers on the planet.
I like that.
Bobby?
I wholeheartedly agree, especially with that with the last thing with the David just said there too. It's like with comics, you're able to try things that like you're willing to see more experimentation in comics, trying different types of stories, trying different types of things, because it's not like a movie studio investing 20 million on gamble. That doesn't happen. That's not, whereas, we might do a comic that we've invested far less than 20 million in to try something new, just to see will it work? Does the story idea work? Is it there? I also think too, we were mentioning the everything that's happened, certainly post-pandemic world with, digital comics kind of becoming a bit more accessible to people. DC and Diamond and all these things kind of imploding. The field is wide open for anybody now to create something that could be the next thing people fall in love with. The only thing holding any of us back is just getting it in front of people. And whether you work for a big publisher or you're doing it yourself, that's still a hurdle we all have to face. And so this puts indie comic creators on almost level footing with large publishers. The only difference is they have more money to throw at something than we do. So I think right now I think there's a golden age of comics coming. I think we're just at the beginning of something that's going to happen. I don't know what it is. If I did, I would probably be farther in front of the curve. But I do think that it is things like the Diamond shutting down. Comic shops suddenly were like, we have no content to sell. And the indie creators were going, we have stuff. And stores who would never have looked at indie stuff a week before Diamond shut down are going, yeah, let me have your book. We'll sell it. So I think that relationship will hopefully grow, and people will start to look at more, because to the audience at large, not people that read comics on a regular basis, but if I ask my dad, about comics are superheroes. That's all they are. He doesn't know anything about comics other than Spider-Man was a comic book before it became a movie. And so if we try to reach out to the audience beyond that, we have to give them something that makes them go, ooh, this is worth me trying. There's a lot of people that don't know some of their favorite movies were based on comics. I felt a huge, and not just superhero stuff, but like when Road to Perdition came out, this is a comic movie. There was a part of me that was going like, I want to see interviews where Paul Newman goes, yeah, this comic book I read or this graphic novel. Of course, they didn't do any of that. But how cool would it have been as a boost for comics, if Tom Hanks goes, have you read this? So I see a lot of that coming. I think we're there. I also, and you'd asked, kind of what the difference is with writing comics as to other stuff. I think there are stories that work better in comic form just because of what you can do. Gregory mentioned the passage of time. That's a brilliant thing. It used to be like Superman's got to go to Mars. Panel 1 is I've got to go to Mars. Panel 2 is Superman arrives on Mars. Today that would be 3 issues. So there is a thing that you can do in comics where certain stories work a certain way, and that's where your writer and artist coming together, you can really create some magic. I have a friend of mine he got into comics because he had a medical procedure done. He had a medical emergency and he wanted to tell that story, and the only way he could tell it was in comic form, because it involved his eye, and it involved like a torn retina or torn cornea or something. And so he was able to put that into a mixture of art and words, where if he had just tried to write like a novel or a piece, just a prose piece, it wouldn't have worked for him. So I think certain things can be done in comics that you just can't do anywhere else. Certainly, you can get into multiple characters' heads more easily than you can in a movie. Now, obviously, in a novel, you can do that as well. But I also like the idea of comics is a lot like science fiction. With science fiction, we use allegory a lot to talk about problems in the real world by setting them on an alien planet, as an example. We can do that in comics as well by showing the world through a different lens. And I think a lot of times that gets overlooked because it is considered that throwaway medium. Or if kids are reading, parents are looking at it as like, oh, it's kid stuff, so it's not, but there's some heady material that can be put in comics. Obviously we've mentioned Mouse, which is a very, deep book. March is the same way. There's a lot of those to where people just realize, oh, I'm just reading a comic. They don't realize that they're getting a deeper story while they're looking at the pretty pictures. And so I think comics is a great way of telling those type of stories and letting it connect with people without beating them over the head with, there's an important message here. You kind of find the message.
I'm sorry. I just was going to say that what you've been saying leads kind of into the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is that we're kind of, as a society, becoming increasingly conscious of the fact that we carry around stereotypes that we apply to each other when we meet without consciously being aware of it. And so what do you think would be a good type of graphic novel to address those kinds of issues, to make us aware of what we do? Kind of like that, let that be your last battlefield Star Trek episode. It was about racism, but people thought it was just about 2 guys who hated each other. And so it provided food for thought. So what would you suggest if you had unlimited money, unlimited publication? What would you use a graphic novel to address with that? Gregory, will you start us off?
Thanks a lot. There's a lot to that question. Boy. Well, I think if I had unlimited funds and unlimited resources, and I had, an unlimited team, and let's be clear, an unlimited time, because that's also important when you're writing these things down. That's maybe the most important resource. But I think probably what I would want to do is draw together elements of stories from different disciplines and cultures, old and new. And I'm being a little vague on purpose, because I think part of what happens is I forget which one of us, it was not me, but which one of the other fine panelists said earlier on, that there are these sort of patterns to stories that come up and develop. And so we see similar kinds of stories being told over time. This is not unique to graphic novels. This is something which happens in multiple, creative forms, obviously, and particularly ones that have any kind of literary element to them, because we are constantly telling the same kinds of stories underpinned by similar kind of emotional conditions. The problem that I sometimes find, and I'll just speak about my own students, is when I'm working with them on fantasy or science fiction, or I'm teaching a particular graphic novel, or I'm looking at, a good example of this would be, for example, Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard Book, which is both book and graphic novel now, and which Neil Gaiman, and frankly, and the book itself is extremely also visual, heavily illustrated. It's not a graphic novel, but it is literally woven through the pages are the illustrations and the work. It's not just text page, it's through the text is woven the illustration. It's one of the things that makes it a really powerful book in a lot of ways, I think, before we even got the graphic novel form. But that, of course, is a response to Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book. It's really a retelling of Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book in different forms. And it's doing this by both paying a certain kind of homage to what that book was, and moving in different directions with it, right? Asking questions, very serious questions that Kipling only really touched on. Gaiman really navigates the questions of divorce, of a disease, of mortality. The book is filled, it's extremely dark, and it's filled with a great deal of attention to mortality and death and what it means to die and the space in between life and death and all these sorts of things. And so it's drawing from Kipling, right? And it's producing something new. And in the graphic novel form, sometimes that's made even more explicit with references to elements of tigers, right? Throwing us back to Shere Khan from The Jungle Book, or other things like that, which wasn't explicitly mentioned because it would have seemed hand-handed to, look at a grave and here lies SK, the tiger of the night, or, something terrible like that, which would have made obvious that he was trying to get this sort of line of influence through. So what I would love to do, I guess, if I had unlimited time and resources and so forth, would be to retell some of those stories. For example, John Gardner's brilliant book, Grendel, which is drawing upon the monster responding to Beowulf, which in turn inspired Gregory Maguire and Wicked and other ones down the line. That book is brilliant, but it's never been done in a fully graphic form. And yet the book itself points in that direction. There are woodcuts in that book that are in the original edition that still is out today, which are beautifully evocative, but they're just single images. And imagining what it would be like with modern technology to be able to do an entire book filled with a essentially woodcut told story of Grendel, the story of Grendel, or to tell the story Grendel from characters that are not necessarily spoken about. Hrothgar, who gets talked about but never told from, or the other characters, Wiglaf, or Unferth, a character who's horrifically misunderstood in a lot of ways according to the Grendel Gardner's version of it. He's not just a brother killer. There's a lot more to Unferth, and in a way, he understands Grendel, one of the few people in the book to understand him, because he's monstrous too. So telling that in a graphic novel form, where you had again that dynamic tension I referred to before, but you got to see it in this beautifully evocative kind of moving woodcut, would be amazing to me. And I've done all of this, of course, while just talking about a bunch of other authors, not mine. But I think that would be what I would love to do, is draw older works together to what a newer and dynamic medium can do to give them some investment in this time that we're in.
David?
Yeah, I think a lot about kind of like what can I do as an individual creator to promote representation and diversity, because anybody watching this, like, you might not know this, but I'm a white Jewish boy in Los Angeles. I'm like the furthest thing from a marginalized person, is particularly where I live. And so a story of me trying to write about the LGBT experience, or the African American experience, or the immigrant experience, that's not going to fly. Like, it's not only going to come off inauthentic, but it's not my story to tell. So the thing that I'm always thinking about is, first off, how can I work with diverse creators to sort of let them have their voice in what we're telling? But also, the thing that I can do, while I can't necessarily tell a story from somebody else's lived-in experience, I find it incumbent upon me as a creator. It's to have as much representation in my characters as possible. This is something I've talked about even back with my first book, Spencer and Locke. My artist and I, Jorge Santiago Jr., we had a long conversation about, should this be a character of color? And the decision was we didn't want it to come across as unintentional stereotype. And that's sort of always the calculus that I'm running when I'm coming up with a new idea is, can this be headlined by someone of color? Can this be headlined by a woman or someone non-binary or anyone with anything other than the cisgender heteronormative sexual orientation? Because I see it, it doesn't just make moral sense. It makes creative sense. And if you really want to be cynical, it makes business sense. You want to keep inviting as many people to the table as possible. You want to build that wider consensus. And at the same time, you also, I think the really important thing that creators can do, and this doesn't require unlimited time or money, it's just to make room. It's just to sort of bring as many diverse creators to the table as possible as far as your collaborators go. And just also kind of making space for people. Sometimes you don't need to hit every single book. And so I think, it's something as an individual creator, I can only kind of chisel away at it. But I feel like every book I do that has, my new book, The OZ, we made it a very deliberate choice to have it headlined by a woman of color, because every book that we do that we aren't making big mention of it in the text. It is just one tiny baby step forward, where maybe my kids will get to be reading these things, and it won't seem like a revolutionary act. It won't seem like a big deal. It'll seem like something that just happens. And I think every creator, this is something kind of from the ground floor up. We really have to be just kind of responsible and just try our best to just keep inviting more people to the table as far as our work is concerned.
John?
So the question is, like, if I had unlimited resources, right, what would I do? Well, I mean, I guess I just keep doing what I've been doing. I mean, but just more. So we think about the notion of stereotypes. I mean, of course, the root word of that word, stereos, comes from the Greek. It means hard or fixed, right? So basically stereotypes are about fixity, and a lot of times, people of color who are working in comics or in any medium or storytelling space are trying to create a wider spectrum of subjectivity, a wider spectrum of experience, because for a long time you would have like, a tokenized representation, or you would have like a really like kind of cookie cutter representation of a person of color or whoever in a space. So, my first book that I did with Damian Duffy, the whole consumer culture, pretty much attacked like stereotypes around Black people. That's what the entire thing was. Since then, just doing like a lot of not only representation, because first of all, you have to uncover the thing. I found that a lot of like works of art or narratives by people of color in particular have been disrupted or covered up or erased, and so first you have to actually reconstruct it and then represent it, so there's an extra step of like, oh my goodness, I had no idea that this thing existed, because there's been a deliberate like disruption of historical space, and so the other thing is like building community. So another thing that I do is I actually co-founded several ethnocentric independent comic book conventions. So like the Schomburg's Black Comic Book Festival, I'm one of the co-founders of that, and I think we're going to like our 10th year. It's like the largest convention, a free convention at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem that brings in a lot of like Black creators in particular. Also, SoulCon, which is in Columbus at Ohio State, along the same time as CXC, and also BCAF, the Black and Brown Comic Arts Festival. So the idea is to create a space where people can congregate to empower themselves through kind of cultural activism, but also financially too, because we're trying to also like make make a profit doing this work too. And then, of course, kind of like piggybacking off of some of the things Greg was talking about was, reimagining these really, really wonderful classics as graphic spaces. So, of course, me and my friend Damien adapted, Kindred and Parable of the Sword by Octavia Butler to graphic novels. But I'm also, with my line, we're actually doing a reimagining of the Count of Monte Cristo as an Afrofuturist solar punk story. It's going to be set like 400 years in the future after the polar ice caps melt.
That's awesome.
In the Caribbean. And and we have like a Bayesian, Barbadian artist drawing it. So that's going to be really cool. Because people tend to forget that, Dumas was a man of color, and it was inspired by his father, in particular. And of course, that novel was also inspired by this other piece he wrote called George that was directly related to like race relations, and stuff like that. And we also doing a book about the Emmett Till murder, but we also are doing, a piece about, the Crop Over Festival in Barbados as a fantasy novel, as a fantasy graphic novel, because you have to remember that, Black joy is a radical act as well. It's not just about, showing the suffering, but also showing the survival and the celebration. So I think it's just a multiple pieces, like to show more representation, of because I think it's just as important to show Black villains as it is to show Black heroes, because it shows a spectrum of representation. So I just keep doing what I'm doing, and teaching the classes that I'm doing, and trying to keep making more work.
Yeah. Well, David, I see we're coming up on the hour.
My carriage is turning into a pumpkin.
Yes. So before your carriage turns into a pumpkin, would you like to tell people where they can find your work?
Yeah, absolutely. You can buy Spencer and Locke 2 and go into the chapel anywhere comics are sold, or Amazon, Comixology, you name it. You can follow my Kickstarter, the OZ. It's at bit.ly/the OZ comic. It's on Kickstarter right now. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Pepose D, David Pepose Comics on Facebook, or subscribe to my newsletter Pep Talks at bit.ly/pepnews. Thank you guys so much for having me. This was a wonderful conversation. I feel like I learned a ton listening to all the geniuses on this that I'm sharing a panel with. So thank you guys for all your wonderful insight.
Well, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Have a good one, guys.
So yeah.
So Bobby, do you want to pick up with unlimited resources and what you would do to fight stereotypes?
Oh, unlimited resources. That's just a dream that I let me just take that in for a minute. You know what? If I was given that directive, I would want to do a comics centric type version of something similar to the original Twilight Zone, where you're doing morality tales, but you're hiding them within a science fiction or a horror story. So again, I think the best way that messages come to me is if I'm not beat over the head with them. And so I think, the Twilight Zone, man, was perfect with telling stories about one thing without you realizing that's what they were talking about until you started thinking about it. And I would gather as many creators as I could and say, okay, mix and match teams to come up with the right stories for, this group would, and let them tell their one and done story. We'd have to figure out size and all that, but let them tell their story instead of trying to do something. We're just going to do this month to month, one big story. Do a bunch of smaller, more personal tales where each creative team could really, it's something they're passionate about. And not only does that put out a story that's a little more diverse, have the people behind the scenes is that way. The creators, get creators from all walks of life, and let them mix and match. And man, it'd be cool to work with you. Let's figure out something. So if I had an unlimited budget, yeah, I would immediately start going through my contact list of artists and writers I've met over the years and going like, have I got a project for you? And that's where I would start.
Alan? Do you have anything to add?
Well, I just want to say, since I'm not necessarily, although I've been thinking about a graphic novel dealing with what it's like to be a caregiver for people in nursing homes and that kind of thing, because it's both comedic and tragic at the same time in general. And you know, I've been working on an outline of something for that. And who knows, maybe I could actually draw it myself. I think that in, you know, in terms of like what John was saying, you know, when we think about Harriman and Crazy Cat, you know, people of color who were sort of hiding sort of behind a persona that, you know, that let them be perceived as other people. But I think the most important thing for us, or for me, as let's say somebody who's not necessarily producing, but actually mediating through classroom instruction, is, oh, and I was going to mention, I'm going to interrupt myself for Greg. There's a new translation of Beowulf by somebody named Mariah Headley.
Yep, I know her. Yep.
And which begins, the very first word is bro.
Yep.
So I love the idea of, and so it's a digression that helps me, because what I want people to do, either visually or through content, is to startle the reader. Mm-hmm. And if the reader's not startled, I mean, if there's not something that sets this apart, and this is why I like teaching Emile Ferris, although I found it difficult to do at the beginning, or giving us something that is a concept, and in some sense thinking about some of the things that Bobby's talking about, and that is repetition, having multiple artists do something, a story like Joseph Conrad's in the Nostromo or something like that, which is a morality tale after all. But something that's really striking that we can't anticipate, or we learn something new about it. And I'll just give you a quick, when I was much, much younger, I went to see John Curry do an ice dancing exhibit on, or performance on the Kennedy Center stage. And what you realized is, since I grew up watching hockey, it's very hard to watch ice dancers on a hockey rink because you know where they are. They're at the blue line, they're at center ice, they're where a penalty shot might be taken from. But all of a sudden, this was on a proscenium stage, and you realize that this is something completely different. And it was so startling. The rhetoric of the movement was so different and very, very important. And one of the things you realize, of course, is one of the things that's easy for dancers to do is to stop. One of the things that's very difficult for ice skaters to do is to stop. And so the continuity of motion meant that there was something very startling in the rhetoric of dance. So I'm thinking about things like that I can bring to my students that say, you know, you've got to spin your head around and think about this differently.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, does anybody want to add anything before we wind up?
I do. I actually would. I'd like to circle back to something John said, and I want to underline it and bold it and put it in, 72-point font. And that is that this idea of the sentence, which I believe you said was Black joy as a radical act. And that struck me because I've had a number of students who have talked to me over the years about exactly this idea of feeling, students of color, about feeling this weight about how they're supposed to represent themselves. And it struck me that this is exactly the problem. And it's something which, again, I think graphic novels can help address, in that there is assumed to be, or was assumed to be, this panoply of experience that the sort of majority white culture experiences. And what is left, the stories that are left for people of color to tell, is their suffering, right? And they're suffering underneath that system, which further focuses then on the system again, instead of focusing on the full panoply of experience that has nothing to do with the system at all. And I just want to point out that the idea of casting one's net widely, of as was said just before he left, the idea of inviting more people to the table, but also of going out of our way to, as we represent characters, to represent them in a variety of fashions, so that not only do you not need to comment on every time a person of color is showing up and doing something, but rather it's part of the regular, it's important. This is a thing that I did because I wanted this. This is a person who is in the world and we're doing this, so that we're not waving a flag about it, which is frustrating on multiple levels, but also that we're allowing then that full kind of panoply of experience to happen. Carlos Hernandez, who did Sal and Gabby Break the Universe and has done many other things, who is Cuban in background, talked a little bit about this in terms of how he wanted to represent what is a very heavily Cubano and driven by sort of Latino ideas and heritages, and is just culturally dripping, right, with his own experience as someone who, you know, grew up for part of his time in Miami and the whole thing. But also he said what was important to him was to represent this in a way where it was just, and I have Cuban main characters, and now we'll go on and tell the rest of the book, right? And it's in a world in which that is not seen as extraordinary and either needs to be remarked upon or violently opposed. It's just a thing that you do, so that, as he said, the default doesn't just become the cis heteronormative white guy, but actually becomes a different kind of default, so that there are multiple defaults, or maybe no default at all, and it's just whatever story you're reading is whichever characters are in it. So I just wanted to highlight that I do think there's a way in which graphic novels can highlight this as the possibility of expanding representation. But part of that, as someone who doesn't do the art but does the writing, is making sure that I'm telling storylines that are trying to represent a full panoply of experiences, and not saying these characters are allowed to speak about anything and these group of characters are allowed to speak about a couple of things, mostly about how the other characters oppress them, because that is so reductive on so many levels. So I basically just wanted to say you're 100% right, and thank you for saying it.
Thank you for saying that. I appreciate that.
Anybody else?
Well, I just want to mention that one of the people that I teach, and I know that, you know, in many ways, Will Eisner was, especially when he did the, what was the name of his major character?
The Spirit, yeah.
Spirit, you know, with the terrible sidekick. I mean, you know, he had his bad moments, but the fascinating thing, and apropos what Gregory's saying, and I think what John is saying, is that I'm not crazy about Eisner's artwork, or because it seems to be very conventional and very derivative in certain ways. On the other hand, the fact that he is willing to represent these characters who are traditionally represented in literature as kind of heroic or survival, you know, from these Jewish characters. I mean, they are all so loathsome that it's very, very startling, and in a very useful and helpful way. I mean, John was saying that why shouldn't there be evil characters who are African American or who are Asian or whatever, or people of color of any stripe. And I'm very self-conscious about being in this group, as not only, I mean, we're a little diverse, but we're all, except for Nancy, we're all male and we're all bearded. But you know, that I think the students find that incredibly useful and striking to see that here's somebody who, you know, I give his background and so on, and then all of these characters are just terrible, awful characters who actually do things that startle them. Just you go back to the word startling them, because they would never be able to conceive of a story where somebody was, you know, would cheat somebody the way that, let's say, Fagin the Jew does, or that the characters in his collection of stories perform, you know. So that it's really an important thing to have that kind of contrast, and to be honest, and to be eclectic across the board. And Alison Bechtel does that wonderfully well, in her own way.
Yeah, I was going to say right quick too, just to kind of piggyback a little bit off of what Alan and Greg was saying, was this notion of the default. You know, one of the things that I love about the Schomburg show is that you have these young Black kids who come to this space. Some of them have never read comics before. This look on their faces when they see people that look like them making characters that look like them. We have an entire generation of kids now who will never know what it's like to not be the center of a story. You know, they have that experience forever. That's something that we had to fight for from my generation, probably before. But now we have this group of kids who's like, you know what, this is, as you're saying, it's become naturalized, and we're just like everybody else, you know, and that's quite wonderful. So yeah, but thank y'all for that. I mean, I really appreciate your words, all of you.
Yeah, I did last year. Last year I did a con. There was a high school here in Georgia. The high school put on a convention during the day. So the classes, the English, I believe it was the English classes, for those periods would come into the library, where there were several of us who did write books and comics were set up. And something was just mentioned here, was mentioned a lot there. That these kids were coming in there, and the biggest surprise for them is, wait, you can do this as a job?
Yep.
This is a real, like, people give you money for this? And we're all like, well, not a lot. but yeah, I think it's one of those things. It's like they knew the comics existed, but until you know how comics exist, they're just a magical thing that appear, you know? And, you know, and I'm sure we've all had our moments of discovering that, but it was a joy to behold all of these. And it was a high school, so, you know, teenagers coming in and just seeing that on their face of like, wait a minute, what? And so because teachers were making it a point too, the creative students, they were making it a point to introduce them, especially, you know, people that like to write, where they were introducing them to the writers, et cetera. And it was just that they just couldn't believe that, you know, that there was something that they could take this thing that they were passionate about, but mostly privately, could actually, you know, they could do something with it. And I love that. I love being able to see that just on their faces, that joy of like realizing that maybe this thing that I'm kind of embarrassed about, or I do it, but I'm afraid people will laugh at me. Well, they're not laughing at anybody over here, you know, and so maybe they won't laugh at me about it. And I love that. That was wonderful.
If you can't see it, you can't be it. Sorry.
I'm sorry, what?
I said, if you can't see it, you can't be it.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that too, because, and that one too, that was very good. I mean, there were a lot of different kinds of creators there. There were creators of color. There were female creators. It wasn't just comics. There were writers. There was some cosplayers. There was a voice actor. So there were different ways that they could all see that, you know, any of you could do this if it's something you're interested in. And it was a wonderful experience. And they were supposed to do it this year again for the second year, but obviously with, you know, the pandemic, it didn't happen. But I'm certainly hoping they're going to do it again next year. And because I found it just, you know, just a wonderful, you know, kind of an uplifting experience for me too, to see that kind of passion for what they liked. It was wonderful.
Great. Well, we're coming up on time, so why don't we wind up, and each of you please tell us where people can find your work. Feel free to name drop your latest project or show your cover, but that'll take us out. So Bobby, why don't we start with you, since we just ended with you?
Okay. Well, you can find me all over the internet. If I have first a social media, I'm probably on it. But bobbynash.com is my website. It's been a while since my last comic came out. I've been mostly doing novels here the last couple of years. Although I did talk with a publisher today, a trade collection of Domino Lady stories. She was an old pulp character from the 30s. And we wrote some team-up stories with her teaming up with other characters from the 30s. And I was talking with the publisher today. That's about to go into be printed and into distribution. So that'll be cool. It's been a little while since I've had a comic, and that's her there in the background there. So I'm excited about that. But you can find me all over social media: Facebook, author Bobby Nash, Instagram Bobby Nash Writes, and Twitter I'm at Bobby Nash. So please say hello.
Alan?
Well, unlike you, I can sell my book Dolphin, which does have a couple of illustrations in it, and I'm of my own, but you wouldn't necessarily be impressed by them because they're kind of technical illustrations. I just completed an article that's in a journal called Configurations, which is called The Sukotiro on the Extinction of a Non-Existent Animal. And it's really about the artistic representation of an animal that never existed over a period of 200 and something years. And the question is, how do we represent animals? All real animals are imaginary, all imaginary animals are real. And so sort of it's more of an academic article, but it's worth exploring if you have an interest in the history of images.
John?
First of all, that's remarkable. I was like, I want to
send you a copy.
I'm like, oh my God, I got a copy of it. First of all, like, I want to stay in touch with everyone because everybody's so wonderful on this panel. Thank you so much for having me. So most of my books you can just find on Amazon. I don't have a website actually, and which is crazy, but most of the stuff you can either find on Comixology or on Amazon. My Instagram account is just John Jennings Art. John Jennings Art is my Instagram. Twitter is J.I. Jennings. My middle name is Ira, so J.I. Jennings. One of the things I'm really, really super excited about is the Megascope line that I was talking about, like a new line of books that are being, imprint of books being put out by Abrams Comic Arts that's specifically look at people of color and speculative fiction. We are also doing some crime fiction and some historical fiction, but primarily speculation, so horror, fantasy, and the like. My newest book is coming out in January. It's an adaptation of a short story by Nnedi Okorafor. It's called After the Rain. It's the first book of that line. But one of the things, this is really kind of embarrassing. It's exciting, but also embarrassing. Is there's a new book about me that just came out today. It's a collection of my interviews over the last decade or so, and it's through the University of Mississippi Press. They do those conversations. So I'm in the conversation with comic artists section, and I was very humbled and proud to be in that section. Also, too, I'm a native Mississippian, so that's our flagship institution. So I was like, so it just came out today. So it's just called Conversations with John Jennings. So.
Gregory?
Yeah, congratulations. That's great. So my work can be found. I've got a few projects that are on the route. I already shamelessly shilled these once, so I'll show them off again. Whoops. I just, it's seeing the art. Again, as you said, I'm sure you've all had this experience, but for those of you who actually can draw yourselves, it's one thing. For those of us who can't, being able to see one's words rendered in this form is very moving, actually. And so these are from the first two books of a 4-book series called The Longest Fall from Athis Arts, Icarus and Jelinek. The retail release of this will drop on November 10th. So they are currently going out to reviewers and blurbers and stuff like that. And I'm very proud of this. The artist is Achala Fabio, who is from Brazil and is extraordinarily good. In fact, I want to make sure that we keep him for books 3 and 4 before he gets snapped up by someone else, because he's super, super good. And I'm just couldn't be happier with how this came out. But that again is, that's Icarus and Jelinek, and can be found by going to Athis Arts is the publisher, ATTHIS arts.com. My website is GregoryAWilson.com. I also have a book, a 5th edition DNA. I have academic stuff as well, but as far as what this panel seems to be a little more closely pitched to, I have a 5th edition source book and adventure, which came out from Alligator Alley Entertainment earlier this year, called Tales and Tomes from the Forbidden Library. And last, I'll just mention, and you can find me everywhere, Gregory A. Wilson on Twitter, etc. I do want to mention very quickly that I run a Twitch TV channel focused on story and narrative. And the latest campaign that's just started, we do a lot of tabletop over there, is a campaign run by my friend Brandon O'Brien, who is a speculative fiction poet from the Caribbean, who is the speculative fiction poetry editor of FIA Literary Magazine, that has a new Ignite Award that just came out, and they're great. And this new one that he has is an all by POC cast, and it is called Sound Clash, The Clampdown, which is about a group of rockers who rise to fame while using their musical magical powers to fight oppression. It is just as good as it sounds, and it's an honor actually to be able to host it, and it is an example, I think, of the joy we were talking about and the breadth of representation that I'm trying to show on the channel and elsewhere. So you can find that on my Twitch channel, which is twitch.tv/ this is a little confusing. Arvin Eleron, character of mine, long story, Arvaneleron. And yes, thank you to everyone here. Thank you to Gail Martin also, who I know worked on my first Icarus thing back in the day and was one of the people who contacted me. So thank you for having me, and thanks to the wonderful panelists too.
Yeah, I'd like to thank all of our guests. You all have been great. We really appreciate your joining us for this. And we appreciate everybody who's watching and hope everybody has a wonderful evening.